Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about how using models can help make you a more intelligent citizen of the world. And so I'm going to break this down into a bunch of sort of sub-reasons about why models just make you better able to engage in all the things that are going on in this modern, complex world in which we live. Okay, so when we think about models, they're simplifications, they're abstractions. So in a sense, there's a sense in which they're wrong. There's a famous quote by George Box where he says, all models are wrong. And that's true, right? They are. But some are useful. And that's going to be a mantra that comes up throughout this course. These models are going to be abstractions, they're going to be simplifications, but they're going to be useful to us. They're going to help us do things in better ways. Okay? So in a sense, right, and this is a big thing in this course, models are the new lingua franca. They're the language of not only the academy, which I talked about some in the last lecture, but they're the language of business, they're the language of politics, they're the language of the nonprofit world. Wherever you go, whether it's people who are trying to do good, make money, cure disease, whatever it is that they want to do, right, you're going to find that people are using models to enable them to be better at what their purpose is. Okay? That's why they've really become the new lingua franca. So if you think back, remember I talked about this in the first lecture, the whole idea behind the Great Books movement was that there was these set of ideas that any person should know. So within the 100 and so great books, there were thousands of ideas. And Mortimer Adler and this Robert Huckins, president of the University of Chicago, they had this thing that they wrote called the Syntopicon, which was a list, right? Adler put this together. It was this giant list of sort of all the ideas that someone should know, right? An intelligent person should know. So what are those ideas? Well, one of those ideas was to tie yourself to the mast. And this comes from the Odyssey, when Odysseus' ship is going past the sirens, and he wants to hear the sirens' beautiful love song. So what he does is he has his crew tie him to the mast. He ties himself to the mast so that he can listen to them, but pre-commit to not driving his boat over to hear the sirens. And at the same time, he puts wax in the ears of his crew so they also won't be encouraged to sort of drive the boat over there. Well, this is an idea that recurs in history, right? We think about Cortez burning his ships, right? So his men won't, retreat. They'll continue to advance. So this idea to tie yourself to mast is a really worthwhile thing. But here's the problem. One of my favorite websites is a website called Opposite Proverbs. So on this website, it says things like, he who hesitates is lost. A stiction time saves 9. Or 2 heads are better than 1. Too many cooks spoil the broth. So you've got this really good advice, something that probably made it in the Syntopicon, but then you get something that says the exact opposite. Well, how do we adjudicate between those two things? The way we adjudicate between those two things is by constructing models, because models give us the conditions under which he who hesitates is lost, and they give us the conditions under which a stiction time saves 9. So when we talk about the value of diversity in prediction, we'll see why it's the case that 2 heads are better than 1, and we'll also see why it's the case that too many cooks spoil the broth. So ironically, what models do is they tie us to a mast. They tie us to a mast of logic, and by tying us to a mast of logic, we figure out which ways of thinking, which ideas in the Syntopicon are useful to us. Okay? So if you look at almost any discipline, whether it's economics, and here what you see in this diagram is you see a description of sort of this is a utility function for an agent, and what that agent is doing, trying to maximize their payoff, right? So economists use models all the time. Biologists use models as well. They have models of the brain where they have little axons and dendrites going between the neurons. They have models of gene regulatory networks. They have models of species, right? Things like that. Sociology, we have models as well, right? So there's models of sort of how your identity affects your actions and your behaviors and things like that, right? In political science, we have models. In political science, this is a picture of a spatial voting model. So they might say candidates are liberal or conservative on certain dimensions, and voters are liberal or conservative. And you say that, well, you're more likely to vote for a candidate who takes positions similar to yourself. So like where I work at the University of Michigan, we have something called the National Election Studies that's run out of there, where we sort of gather all this data about where politicians are and where voters are, and that allows us to make sense of who votes for whom and why. Okay, so models help us understand the decisions people make. Linguistics, right? Here's another area, right? So you might think, how can you use models in linguistics? Well, this little model here, you see things where it says, you see V's and N and P's in here if you look closely. Well, V stands for verb, N stands for noun, right? And what you got to, and S stands for, subject, let's say, right? And so what you can do is you can ask, what is the structure of a language? You can ask formally and mathematically, what are the structure of a language is, and whether some languages are more like other languages and not, depending on how people set up their sentences. So in German, where they may put all the adjectives at the end of the sentence, that looks very different than, let's say, English. All right? Even the law. This is a graph from one of my graduate students, former graduate students, now he's a law professor, Dan Katz, where he's got sort of a network model of which Supreme Court justices, who they appoint. So if someone appoints judges from some other judge. By putting that data that's out there in this sort of model-based form, we can begin to understand how conservative and how liberal certain judges are. All right? So there's lots of ways to use models, and there's even whole disciplines now that have evolved that are based entirely on models. So game theory, which is what I was really trained in as a graduate student, is all about strategic behavior. It's the study of strategic interactions between, individuals, companies, nations, right? And game theory can also be applied to biology, right? So there's all sorts of stuff, right? When you go to college, you go to grad school, you'll find that there's game theory models of just about anything, right? So it's actually a field based entirely just on models, right? Why? Right? Why all these models? Why does everything from linguistics to economics to political science use models? Well, because they're better, right? They're just better than we are. So let me show you a graph here. This is a graph from a book by Phil Tetlock. It's a fabulous book. And in this graph, what he's showing is the accuracy of some different, let me pull up a pen here, different ways of predicting. So what you see on this axis here, this calibration axis right here, this is asking showing you how accurate a model is. And this axis is saying how discriminating is it in terms of how particular, how fine of predictions is it making. So instead of saying is it hot or cold, it might be saying it's going to be 90 degrees or 80 degrees or 70 degrees. So this axis here, this up and down axis is discrimination, and this axis is how accurate. So what you see here down here are hedgehogs. So these are people who use a single model. Hedgehogs are not very good at predicting, right? They're terrible at predicting. Up here are people he calls foxes. Now foxes are people who use lots of models. They have sort of lots of loose models in their head. And they do much better, sort of at calibration, a little bit better discrimination than individuals. But way up here, better than anybody, are formal models. Formal models just do better than either foxes or hedgehogs. Now, you might ask, how much data is this? Well, Tetlock actually had tens of thousands of predictions. So over a 20-year period, he gathered predictions by people and compared how those people did to models, and the answer is models do much, much better. Okay? All right. So what about people then who actually make predictions for a living? So this is a picture of Bruce Bruno de Mesquita, who makes predictions about what's going to happen in international relationships, and he's very good at it. He's so good at it that they put his picture on the cover of magazines, right? And he's at Stanford and NYU. He's chair of the department at NYU. He used to be anyway. So Bruce uses models. He's got a very elaborate model that helps him figure out, based on sort of bargaining position and interest, what different countries are going to do. But just like George Box said at the beginning, he doesn't base his decision entirely on that model. What the model does is gives him guidance as to what he then thinks. So it's a blending of what the formal model tells him and what his experience tells him. So smart people who use models, but the models don't tell them what to do. Okay. Another reason models have taken over. Yeah, they're better, but they're also really fertile. So once you learn a model that's, for one domain, you can apply it to a whole bunch of other domains, which is fascinating. So we're going to learn something called Markov processes, which are models about dynamic processes. So they could be used to model things like disease spread and stuff like that, right? We're going to find when we learn those that you can also use them, this is sort of surprising, to figure out who wrote a book. You might say, how does that happen? Well, that happens because you can think of words, writing a sentence as a dynamic process. So different authors, right, use different sequences of words, different patterns. So therefore we can use this mathematical model that wasn't developed in any way for this purpose to figure out who wrote what book. Okay? Totally cool. All right. Another big reason. Models really make us humble. The reason they make us humble is we just have to lay out sort of all the logic, and then we realize, holy cow, I had no idea that this was going to happen. Right? So oftentimes when we construct a model, we're going to get very different predictions than what we thought before. Right? So if you look at things, here's a picture of the tulip graph, right, from when there was a big, in the 17th century, when there was this big spike in tulip prices. You can imagine that people thought that prices were going to continue to go up and up and up. Well, if you had a simple linear model, you might have invested heavily in tulips and lost a lot of money. So one reason that models make us humble is, remember, go back to the George Box quote, all models are wrong, right? So a model is going to be wrong. But the models are humbling to us because they make us sort of see the full dimensionality of a problem. So once we try and write down a model of any sort of system, it's a very humbling exercise because we realize how much we've got to leave out to try and understand what's going on. All right. Here's another example, right? This is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. And what you see is you see prices going up and up and up, right? And then you see this, let me put the pen up here, precipitous crash right here, right? A lot of people had models that just said, look, things are going to continue this way. There were a few people that had models that said things go down. These people, the ones whose models went down, they made a lot of money. These people thought it was going to go up, it didn't. So we're always going to see a lot of diversity in models, and we're not going to know really often until after the fact which one is right. And so one thing that's going to be really important is to have many models. So let's go back to that fox-hedgehog graph, right, that I showed you before. The foxes, the people with lots of models, did much better than the hedgehogs, the people with no models. And formal models did better than the foxes. But what would do better than formal models? Well, people with lots of formal models, right? So if we really want to make sense of the world, what we want to do is have lots of formal models at our disposal. So what we're going to do in this class, it's almost like, remember the old 1632 box of Crayolas? That's sort of what we're doing here, right? We're just going to pick up a whole bunch of models, and we're going to have them, right? They're fertile. We can apply them across a bunch of settings. So when we're confronted with something, what we can do is pull out our models, ask which ones are appropriate, and in doing so, right, be better at what we do. So the essence of Tetlock's book, right, that's where that graph came from, of the foxes and hedgehogs, is that the only people who are really even better than what he has a way of classifying what a random choice would be. The only people who are better than random at predicting what's going to happen are people who use multiple models. And that's the kind of people that we want to be. Okay, so that's sort of the big intelligent citizen of the world logic, right? Models are incredibly fertile. They make us humble. They help, really clarify the logic. And they're just better, right? So if you want to be out there, helping change the world in useful ways, it's really, really helpful to have some understanding of models. Thank you very much.